I hadn't thought about Mike in years, not in the way I used to. Time, they say, heals all wounds, but it doesn't. It festers. It takes those old wounds and buries them just deep enough that you can almost forget they're there. Almost. Until something, or someone, comes along and rips them open again. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, grainy and creased, of High Street Station. The station. The place where everything had gone wrong. I felt my breath catch as I turned the photo over, revealing a message scratched into the back with what looked like the same jittery handwriting. "You left me down there." My hands shook as I stared at the words, disbelief mixing with something much darker, something more familiar. Guilt. High Street Station. I hadn't been back there since the night Mike died, and I swore I never would. But now, standing in my kitchen, the smell of old paper filling my nose, I knew I didn't have a choice. Whoever sent the letter knew. I tried to push the memories back, but they surged forward with a force that almost knocked me over. Mike's laugh, echoing off the walls of the empty station. The way the shadows had twisted around the platform that night, like living things waiting for one of us to step too close. And then the scream that haunted me for years afterward. I threw the letter down on the table and stepped away as if it had burned me. I didn't need to read it again. I didn't need to see the photo to know what it meant. My mind was already working, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself that this was just some cruel joke. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the letter had found its way to me for a reason. Maybe I had left something behind that night, something unfinished, and maybe it was time to face it. I stood in my kitchen, the air suddenly feeling too thick, too heavy. The smell of my half-cooked dinner was nauseating now, and I turned off the stove without thinking. My hands were trembling. The words echoed in my mind. "You left me down there." 4 hours. I tried to resist the pull. I drank, I smoked, I paced the small rooms of my house, but every step brought me closer to a decision I didn't want to make. As night fell and the city outside my window settled into an uneasy quiet, I found myself standing at the door, keys in hand. I hadn't even realized I'd put on my shoes. I don't know what I was expecting as I drove across the city, back to that part of town I'd vowed never to visit again. The streets seemed darker, emptier, as if the very air had changed since I last passed through here. Maybe it had. Maybe I had. By the time I arrived at High Street Station, the sky was black, the stars swallowed by the haze of the city's lights. The entrance to the station loomed before me, more decrepit than I remembered. The rusting gates hung open, a black maw that seemed to breathe, waiting for me. I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkened tunnel below. For the briefest moment, I thought about turning around. I could leave now. No one would know. But the photo in my pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling me forward. "You left me down there." With one last glance at the empty street behind me, I took a deep breath and descended into the dark. The moment my foot hit the first step, a wave of cold air swept up from the depths of the station, sharp and biting. It didn't feel like a normal draft. It was too deliberate, too chilling, as if the station itself was exhaling. I paused, gripping the rusted railing, and forced myself to breathe. One step at a time, I told myself, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The stairs creaked under my weight, echoing in the hollow stairwell. As I descended, the light from the street above slowly faded, swallowed by the suffocating darkness below. A part of me hoped that the electricity had long since died, that the entire station had been abandoned, left to rot like some forgotten tomb. But the hum of the distant, flickering lights told me otherwise. High Street Station hadn't been used in decades, not since the accident. No one came down here anymore. The city had built new lines, new routes, bypassing this place like it was cursed. And maybe it was. At the bottom of the stairs, The station opened up before me like a gaping wound. The once bright tiles on the walls were cracked and yellowed, their surfaces smeared with grime and time. Old graffiti bled through the walls, overlapping like desperate cries for attention from a world that had moved on. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something foul like decay. My nostrils flared, and I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to gag. I hadn't been back here since that night. The memories flooded back all at once, like someone had torn open a floodgate in my mind. Mike and I had stood right here, laughing, joking about the lateness of the hour, completely oblivious to what was waiting for us. I could almost see him standing beside me now, a ghost from the past. I blinked, and the image dissolved into shadow. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the photo again. That damn picture. It was like it had a pulse, a life of its own, drawing me deeper into the station. I pulled it out, holding it under the flickering light. The grainy image of the platform stared back at me, so familiar and yet distorted by time. I had tried so hard to forget this place, but now, standing here again, it was all I could think about. I took a step forward, the sound of my footfalls swallowed by the cavernous emptiness of the station. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of electricity and the occasional drip of water leaking from the cracked ceiling. It was as if the station had been frozen in time, a monument to everything that had gone wrong that night. The platform loomed ahead, stretching into the shadows like a forgotten road to nowhere. The tracks, long since abandoned, were overgrown with weeds, the metal rails rusted and bent. But it wasn't the decay that unnerved me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there, listening, straining my ears for any sign of movement. At first, there was nothing, just the hollow emptiness of the station. But then, faintly, I heard it. A whisper, low and indistinct, like a voice carried on the wind. My breath caught in my throat. It couldn't be. I strained to hear it again, but the sound had vanished, swallowed by the oppressive silence. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat like a hammer against my ribs. I wanted to run, to get out of this place, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I hadn't come this far just to turn back. I had to know. I had to see. With shaking hands, I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked tiles and the disintegrating posters that clung to the walls like memories of a past life. The light wavered as my hand trembled, but I forced myself to move forward, toward the far end of the platform. It was there, where the light barely reached, that I saw it, an outline, faint but unmistakable. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the beam, watching me. Mike! The words slipped from my lips before I could stop it. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It simply stood there, waiting. My heart raced as I took another step forward, the light trembling in my hand. The figure began to blur at the edges, like a smudge on an old photograph. My chest tightened. I tried to focus, tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but the figure remained just out of reach, an elusive shadow. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished, swallowed by the darkness. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to steady myself, but when I opened them again, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever was waiting for me in the depths of this station, I had to face it. The platform seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing the edges of my flashlight's beam. The air grew heavier with each step I took, as if the walls were pressing in on me, constricting my breath. I had to remind myself to keep moving forward, one step at a time, even though my instincts screamed at me to run back up the stairs and leave this cursed place behind. That's when I heard it again. The whisper. This time, it was unmistakable. A low, rasping voice carried through the tunnel, its tone almost conversational, like someone speaking from a distance. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart hammering in my chest. "John!" The voice echoed off the walls, distorted and eerie. I swallowed hard, struggling to keep my composure. There was no way I'd heard that correctly. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, filling the silence with the sound of my own fears. But then it came again, clearer this time, like someone was standing just a few feet away. "John, you left me." My throat tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The voice was unmistakable. Mike's voice, calling out to me from somewhere deep within the station. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles turned white, the beam shaking in my trembling hand. I forced myself to move forward, drawn toward the sound like a moth to a flame. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, as if the station itself was resisting my advance. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, weaving through the air like a thin thread of smoke. "John, why did you leave me?" I wanted to answer, to call out and tell him that I hadn't meant to leave him, that it wasn't my fault. But the words caught in my throat, stuck behind a wall of guilt and fear that I had been carrying for far too long. As I reached the far end of the platform, my flashlight flickered. The bulb buzzed, its light dimming for a moment before stabilizing again. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly panned the beam across the walls, desperate to find the source of the voice. But there was nothing, just empty tracks, rusted rails, and the decaying remnants of a once bustling station. The voice had gone quiet, leaving me alone with the steady hum of the dying lights. For a moment, I thought I might have imagined it all, just another cruel trick my mind was playing on me. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the wall, just above the tracks, was a smear of red paint, stark against the dingy tiles. It hadn't been there before. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, the smell of rust and something metallic growing stronger with each step. I leaned in, squinting in the dim light. It wasn't paint. It was blood. My stomach churned, and I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. I cursed under my breath and knelt to pick it up, but as my fingers closed around the cold metal, I heard it again. "John, come find me." The voice was louder now, closer. I stood up, the flashlight beam steady in my grip as I scanned the area around me. The platform was empty. There was no one here. But the voice, it was so real, so close that I could almost feel Mike's breath on the back of my neck. "John!" I whirled around, but there was nothing. My heart raced, and I took a few shaky steps back toward the tunnel. The air had grown colder, the smell of damp stone and rust overpowering. I knew I couldn't leave, not now. I had come too far. With a deep breath, I steeled myself and stepped off the platform, down onto the tracks. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, pulling me deeper into the tunnel's maw. Each footfall echoed in the darkness, the sound distorted and strange, as if the walls were twisting and shifting around me. I was getting closer, closer to the truth, closer to Mike. But deep down, I knew that whatever waited for me in the dark might not be the friend I had lost. It might be something far worse. I walked along the tracks, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots punctuating the silence. The tunnel stretched ahead like an endless void, the faint echoes of my footsteps swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The flashlight beam flickered again, the light struggling to pierce the thick, black air. My heart thudded against my ribs, but I pressed forward, determined to see this through, whatever it took. The whispers had faded into the background now, replaced by a low, rhythmic sound, like the steady churning of wheels against rails, growing louder with each step I took. My pulse quickened as I scanned the tunnel ahead, half expecting to see a long-abandoned train hurtling toward me from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the endless tracks stretching into the abyss. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was another trick of the light, a shadow cast by my flickering flashlight, a fragment of a memory long buried in the recesses of my mind. But as I drew closer, the figure became clearer. He stood a few yards ahead of me, facing away, his form barely illuminated by the weak light. He was tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform that looked like it had been plucked from another era, the fabric tattered and worn. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaky but determined. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. He simply stood there, as if waiting for me to catch up. My chest tightened with anxiety, but I couldn't stop now. I took another step forward, then another, until I was close enough to see the details of his uniform, the faded gold buttons, the worn leather of his cap, the dark stains that marred the fabric. "Who are you?" I repeated, louder this time. Slowly, the figure turned toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. My breath caught in my throat as his face came into view. His eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light, and his skin was pale, almost translucent, as if he had been pulled from the grave. "I'm the conductor," he said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to reverberate through the tunnel. "I've been waiting for you, John." My heart pounded in my chest. How did he know my name? I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat, trapped behind a wall of fear. "You left something behind," the conductor continued, his tone calm, almost soothing, as if he were discussing a lost suitcase rather than a lifetime of guilt. "You've been carrying it with you all this time, haven't you? The weight of it, the burden. But it's still here, waiting for you." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze, though it felt like staring into a bottomless pit. "What do you mean? What did I leave behind?" The conductor's lips curled into a thin smile. "The truth," he said softly. "It's down there, deeper in the station, where you left it all those years ago. You know what you need to do, don't you?" I shook my head, stepping back instinctively. "I don't understand. What truth? What are you talking about?" His smile widened, but it didn't reach his hollow eyes. "You'll see soon enough," he whispered. "But first, you have to go back. Back to where it all began." A shiver ran down my spine, and I clenched my fists, trying to keep the rising panic at bay. The tunnel seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in, making it harder to breathe. The conductor stood still, watching me with that eerie, knowing smile. I wanted to turn and run, to leave the station and never look back. But something inside me, a voice, a presence, maybe my own guilt, kept me rooted to the spot. I had to know. I had to see this through. The conductor stepped to the side, gesturing down the tunnel with a slow, sweeping motion. "Go on," he said. "It's waiting for you." I hesitated for a moment, staring down the tracks into the blackness ahead. The air was thick with tension, charged with the weight of the unknown. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far, and the answers I had been avoiding for so long were just within reach. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, leaving the conductor behind. His presence lingered at my back, a ghostly reminder of what awaited me deeper in the station. The rhythmic churning of the phantom wheels grew louder, as if the very heart of the station was alive, calling me deeper into its bowels. And somewhere ahead, beyond the dark and the shadows, I knew Mike was waiting for me. The darkness ahead seemed to thicken, swallowing the dim light from my flashlight until I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The rhythmic sound of phantom wheels continued, a low, constant rumble beneath my feet, as if a train was circling somewhere just out of sight. The tunnel was tighter now, the walls damp and covered with moss, and the air smelled of rust and decay. Each step felt heavier than the last, and my mind swirled with a mix of fear and anticipation. The conductor's words echoed in my head, The truth is down there, where it all began. But what truth? I had been there the night Mike died. I knew what had happened. I had been there. But something didn't sit right. Something had always felt off. The tunnel seemed to bend and twist in ways I didn't remember, and with every step, the world around me began to blur. Memories surged to the surface, disjointed and vivid, playing like flickering film reels in the corners of my mind. I saw Mike laughing beside me, his voice echoing off the empty walls of the station. His carefree grin, the way he joked about the late shift and how we'd grab a beer afterward. But then the laughter faded, replaced by something else. His scream. I heard it again, as clear as the day it happened, reverberating through the tunnel like a phantom cry. I stopped in my tracks, gasping for air, as the shadows around me seemed to shift and writhe. My flashlight flickered again, casting distorted shapes against the tunnel walls, shapes that twisted and elongated into familiar forms. Mike's form. His shadow loomed large in front of me, but it wasn't just a memory anymore. It was something darker, something alive. The shadow seemed to move, its edges rippling like water. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight trembling as I aimed it toward the figure. It stood still for a moment, watching me, before it began to shift and blur, its outline distorting into something almost unrecognizable. My breath came in short, ragged bursts as I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it really Mike? Or was it something else? Something that had been twisted and warped by the years of guilt I carried? The shadow advanced, slow and deliberate, its movements fluid and unnatural. I tried to move, to step back, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, as if the very earth beneath me was holding me in place. The air around me grew colder, a chill settling deep in my bones. "Mike!" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Is that you?" The shadow stopped, lingering just at the edge of my flashlight's reach. For a moment, I thought I saw his face, Mike's face, staring back at me. But it was wrong. The eyes were hollow, empty voids that reflected nothing but darkness. His mouth twisted into a cruel grin, mocking me. "You left me," the shadow hissed, its voice low and guttural, nothing like Mike's. I recoiled, my skin crawling as the words sank in. This wasn't Mike. It couldn't be. This was something else, something born from my own guilt, my own fear. The station was playing tricks on me, twisting my memories into something grotesque. The shadow lunged forward, and I staggered back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and for a moment, I was completely blind. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to find the flashlight, my fingers brushing against cold metal as I fumbled to pick it up. I flicked it back on, the beam cutting through the darkness just in time to see the shadow retreat into the depths of the tunnel, disappearing into the black void. My chest heaved as I caught my breath, my mind racing with confusion and terror. What the hell was that? What was happening to me? I stood there for a long moment, the silence deafening around me, the air thick with tension. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't Mike. But it had come from somewhere deeper in the station, and if I wanted answers, I would have to keep moving. With trembling hands, I steadied the flashlight and took another step forward. The shadows danced at the edges of my vision, but I forced myself to ignore them, to focus on what lay ahead. Somewhere down there, beneath the weight of all this darkness, was the truth, and I wasn't leaving until I found it. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, winding deeper into the earth with every step I took. The shadows clung to the walls like living things, shifting and rippling in the corners of my vision. My legs felt heavy, my feet dragging along the tracks as if the very ground beneath me was trying to hold me back. But I couldn't stop. Not now. The whispers had returned, faint and indistinct, like a chorus of voices just beyond my reach. I could almost make out words, fragmented and slurred, but they slipped away as soon as I tried to focus on them. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of my own pulse echoing in my ears. Then, ahead of me, I saw it, a faint glow, barely visible in the distance, flickering like a dying flame. I quickened my pace, drawn to the light like a moth to the flame. As I approached, the tunnel began to widen, the walls curving outward into a cavernous chamber. The air grew colder, the smell of rust and decay stronger. My flashlight flickered again, but the glow ahead remained steady, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I stepped into the chamber, my breath catching in my throat as I took in the scene before me. In the center of the chamber stood an old train car, its once bright paint faded and peeling. The windows were shattered, the metal rusted and bent, but it was unmistakable, the very train car where Mike had died. The memories surged forward, crashing over me like a tidal wave. I had been there, standing just outside the car, calling out to Mike as he climbed inside. The details were blurry, hazy with time, but the feeling was the same. Panic, fear, guilt. I had hesitated. I had let him go in alone. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a whirlwind of voices, each one echoing with accusations. You left him. You left him to die. I stumbled forward, my legs trembling beneath me as I approached the train car. The door hung open, creaking slightly as it swayed on its rusted hinges. I could see the inside, dark, empty, except for one thing. In the middle of the car, just as the conductor had said, was the truth. A figure sat in the far corner, hunched over and still. My breath hitched as I realized who it was. Mike, or at least, what was left of him. His body was decayed, little more than a skeleton draped in tattered clothes, his once bright eyes now hollow sockets staring into the void. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move closer. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the longer I stared at the figure, the more real it became. The air around me grew thick, heavy with the weight of the past, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. And then, the figure moved. My heart stopped as Mike's skeletal hand twitched, his head slowly turning toward me. His hollow eyes seemed to lock onto mine, and for a moment, time stood still. The whispers faded into the background, replaced by a deafening silence. John. His voice was weak, barely more than a breath, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Why did you leave me? I stumbled back, my pulse racing. This couldn't be happening. Mike was dead. He had been dead for years. But here he was, sitting before me, his voice filled with the same pain and confusion that had haunted me for so long. I didn't mean to, I stammered, my voice shaking. I tried to help you. You didn't try hard enough, Mike interrupted, his voice growing stronger, more accusatory. You could have saved me, John. You should have saved me. Tears welled up in my eyes, the guilt rising in my chest like a tidal wave. He was right. I had hesitated. I had let my fear paralyze me, and because of that, Mike had died. I had left him behind, and now, all these years later, I was paying the price. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, Mike. The figure remained still, watching me with those hollow eyes. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. And then, slowly, Mike began to fade, his form dissolving into the darkness like smoke. I stood there, frozen in place, as the train car seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls buckled, the ceiling cracked, and the floor beneath my feet began to tremble. The ground shook violently, and I stumbled backward, barely managing to keep my balance. The whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. The truth. The truth. I tried to move, tried to run, but the ground beneath me crumbled, giving way to a black void that swallowed the entire chamber. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath as the weight of my guilt pressed down on me from all sides. The truth had been revealed, but it wasn't the closure I had hoped for. It was something far darker, far more insidious, and I realized, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that I wasn't leaving this place. Not yet. Not until I had paid for my sins. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was Mike's face, staring at me from the shadows, a twisted smile curling across his lips. The darkness wrapped around me like a shroud, suffocating and cold. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything beyond the relentless beat of my own heart. For a moment, I thought it was over, that the station had finally claimed me, pulling me into whatever hell it had reserved for the guilty. But then, just as quickly as it had enveloped me, the darkness began to lift. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the faint glow that surrounded me. The chamber had changed. The train car was gone, replaced by a barren expanse of cracked concrete and twisted metal. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, and the whispers, those damned whispers, still echoed in the distance, just loud enough to send a chill down my spine. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around. I was alone. The shadows that had danced along the edges of my vision were gone, replaced by a stillness that felt almost oppressive. The truth had been revealed, but it hadn't brought the closure I had expected. Instead, it had left me feeling hollow, empty, like a piece of me had been ripped away and cast into the void. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The whispers grew louder, circling around me like a swarm of angry bees, and I could feel the weight of their accusations pressing down on me. You left him. You left him. The words cut deep, sinking into my flesh like 1,000 tiny needles. I staggered forward, my body aching with the effort, and saw something up ahead. A faint light, flickering in the distance, like the dying embers of a fire. It called to me, pulling me forward with an invisible force, and I followed, too tired to resist. As I drew closer, I saw that the light was coming from a small, crumbling platform, barely big enough to stand on. At the center of the platform was a single, rusted chair, its legs bound with frayed ropes that had long since rotted away. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew, this was it. This was where it had all begun. This was where it would all end. I approached the chair slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers were deafening now, filling the air with their relentless accusations, and I could feel the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like a lead blanket. This is it, I thought to myself. This is what I have to do. I stepped onto the platform and stood before the chair, staring down at it with a mixture of fear and resignation. The ropes dangled loosely from the legs, swaying gently in the stagnant air. It was almost as if they were waiting for me to take my place, to finish what I had started all those years ago. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, and slowly lowered myself into the chair. The metal was cold against my skin, sending a shock of ice through my bones. I gripped the arms of the chair tightly, my knuckles turning white, and took a deep breath. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel something shifting in the air around me. The shadows seemed to close in, pressing against me from all sides, and I knew, this was it. This was my penance, my atonement. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words barely audible over the cacophony of voices. I'm so sorry. The chair creaked beneath me, its rusted frame groaning under the weight of my guilt. The shadows pressed closer, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But then, something strange happened. The whispers began to fade, their voices growing softer, more distant. The shadows seemed to pull back, retreating into the corners of the room, and the oppressive weight that had been crushing me for so long began to lift. I opened my eyes, and there, standing before me, was Mike. He looked different now. His face was no longer twisted with anger or accusation. Instead, he looked peaceful, almost serene. His hollow eyes were gone, replaced by the familiar warmth I remembered so well, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. "You did it," Mike said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "You're free." I stared at him, unable to speak, the tears streaming down my face. I had done it. I had faced the truth, faced my guilt, and now I was free. Mike smiled, that familiar grin I had missed for so long, and nodded once before fading away, his form dissolving into the darkness like smoke. The shadows were gone. The whispers were gone. And I was alone, truly alone. But for the first time in years, the silence wasn't deafening. It was peaceful. I stood up from the chair, my body feeling lighter than it had in a long time, and took a deep breath. It was over. I had paid for my sins. And now, finally, I could leave this place behind. The air in the station felt different now, lighter, as though the heavy weight that had pressed down on me since I first stepped foot inside had lifted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe without the oppressive sense of dread gnawing at my chest. The echoes of the past had receded, leaving behind a stillness that was almost comforting. I stood there for a moment, taking in the silence, letting it wash over me. Mike was gone, truly gone this time, and with him, the guilt and the shame that had haunted me for so long. I could still feel the chair beneath me, its cold metal imprinting itself on my skin, but the chains that had bound me to this place, both physical and emotional, had been broken. I wasn't sure how long I'd been sitting there, but now that I was standing, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known I was capable of. My legs trembled slightly as I took a step forward, half expecting the station to pull me back into its dark embrace. But nothing happened. The shadows stayed at bay, and the whispers remained silent. The platform was still crumbling, the walls cracked and peeling, but it felt different now. Less menacing, more like an old relic, a piece of the past that had lost its power over me. I glanced back at the spot where Mike had stood, but there was nothing there, just empty space. A faint smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. I had done it. I had faced my demons, faced the truth, and now I was free to leave this place behind. With a deep breath, I started toward the tunnel, the path ahead of me clear for the first time. My flashlight, now dim and sputtering, barely lit the way, but I didn't need it anymore. I knew where I was going. The tunnel was no longer the labyrinth of fear and regret it had once been. It was just a tunnel, an old, forgotten passage leading back to the world above. As I walked, the air grew warmer, fresher, and I could feel the cool breeze of the night air waiting for me at the surface. My steps became lighter, each one bringing me closer to freedom, to closure. The memory of that night, the night Mike died, no longer felt like a burden I had to carry. It had happened. I had made my peace with it, and now I could finally let it go. I climbed the last few steps, the rusted metal groaning beneath my feet, and emerged from the station into the night. The street was quiet, the city lights casting a faint glow over the empty buildings. The air smelled clean and crisp, a far cry from the damp, decaying scent that had filled the station below. I took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air, and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush against my face. It was over. I had survived. And now, finally, I could go home. I turned to leave, but as I took my first step away from the station, something caught my eye. Standing at the entrance to the subway, just barely visible in the shadows, was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, his dark hair tousled and his eyes wide with curiosity. He was staring down into the darkness, as if something down there was calling to him, pulling him in. A chill ran down my spine. I took a step toward him, my heart racing again, but before I could say anything, he looked up at me. His eyes were bright, almost too bright, and for a moment, I thought I saw something familiar in them, something that reminded me of the conductor. He smiled, a small, almost knowing smile, and then turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. I stood there for a long moment, staring after him, a strange feeling settling in my chest. Maybe the station's story wasn't over after all. Maybe, in some strange way, it never would be. With a final glance at the entrance, I turned and walked away, leaving High Street Station behind. The past was the past, but the shadows would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next soul to wander too deep. If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.